Welcome to the season of crisis and a storm relentless in its fury. Let's look at The Fourth Turning is Here by Neil Howe. His colleague, the late Strauss, the Strauss-Howe cyclical view of history, took the historical profession by storm. Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States, said their perspective on history, the books that they were putting out back then, were the best books on history that he'd ever read. The power elite themselves see value in this view of history, its predictive power. And I'm going to share with you the four seasons. I'm going to look at just a few of America's turnings from winter to spring. And you're going to go, oh yeah, this does happen in a heartbeat. There can be decades where nothing happens, but then there are weeks when decades happen. What is the most likely season of history on the Strauss-Howe cycle theory? I get it. We got to just go, take a deep breath. Be still and know that He is God. Rest in His righteousness alone. Lift up our heads, for our redemption draweth nigh. Now I'm going to get a little more academic on you now, okay? Let's talk about historical cycles. Time is naturally viewed as cyclical because the sun, we circle and cycle the sun. We turn as the earth. The moon circles, cycles. There's a circuit of time in the very solar system in which we inhabit. Students of the Bible have noticed cycles like this. Pride and wickedness leads to destruction and suffering, which ideally brings us to humility and repentance, which produces righteousness and prosperity. But if that prosperity is taken for granted, it goes right back to pride and wickedness. Here's a historical cycle that historians have noted. Hard times make strong men. Strong men make good times. But good times have a tendency to make weak men. And weak men make hard times. Roman historians were able to observe their history after a period of time of existing as an empire. And they noted, two of them at least, got the reputation as being prophets because they just noted 80 to 110-year periods of time tended to cycle with certain patterns of historical developments and movements. Tytler's cycle of nations is another one. You can look at empires. They tend to go like this from birth to death, and you'll see Israel. Same thing, ancient Israel. You start in bondage. We were slaves in Egypt, but you get from bondage spiritual freedom. Let my people go is the biblical concept of spiritual freedom. From spiritual freedom to great courage. Caleb and Joshua, we can go up and possess it. From great courage to liberty, as well as liberty's corollary danger that you find in the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's not liberty, that's being a slave to sin. But liberty can produce abundance, a land of milk and honey. Abundance, that tends toward complacency. Unfortunately. God said in Deuteronomy 8, when I bring you into this land, if you forget the Lord your God, in other words, if you become complacent, you think, look at what my hands have developed for me, your nation, in verse 20, is going to be overthrown like the Canaanite nations that you are overthrowing. Complacency then leads to dependence or to bondage, like, give us a king to rule over us. Or here come the Assyrians, here come the Babylonians to take you back to bondage because you became complacent. Now, I'm describing cyclical view of history. There's also a linear view of history. We normally look at history as being on timelines. So we think of the linear view of history. But I'm asking the question, is it cyclical or is it linear? And also I'm asking the question, is history progressive or is it regressive? Well, let's look at this. I'd say, biblically speaking, there is a linear notion to history because there was a beginning and there's a destination. Christ's second coming is the destination. The beginning is just creation, Genesis. I mean, there was a beginning before that, but this earth's history begins with creation, and human beings degrade ever since the fall. 4,000 years of the degradation of the race took place from Adam to the second Adam, Jesus Christ. But for the redeemed, we can be onward and upward with the growing unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. The weeds and the wheat both grow together. So the history profession tends to have either a progressive view of, 1400s, Renaissance, 1500s, Protestant Reformation, 16 and 1700s, civic revolutions and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, all these positive growth changes. 19th century, Industrial Revolution, 20th century, the extension of liberal democracy and all these good things. It's a progressive movement, and Francis Fukuyama, the famous historian, said that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, we arrived at the end of history. The end of history. The universalization of liberal democracy, he said. Now, that's not our destination. We do have a destination. It's linear, but we will just be on a plane of joy and rising and growing for eternity in heaven and then heaven on earth. But linear, true, but also cyclical. I want to superimpose one over the other and coin a new term for you today. We don't go cyclical, kind of like reincarnation in the Eastern view of yin and yang and all that. No, but we do tend to see cycles in history. Just we can look at that academically. We can look at that through scientific lenses, through social science, and see there are cycles. But it's also cycles superimposed upon a linear timeline, some of which, the wheat, which are growing up, and some of which, the weeds, the world, are degrading. So is that a pretty good biblical worldview of history? So if it is, then America as an empire is going to be on the cycle of decline, and it has really hit that decline period. Even the mainstream media admits it. America is an empire in decline. Now they say, New York Times says that doesn't mean it has to fall. Au contraire. The Bible says America will morph into speaking like a dragon, and every principle of our once free republic will be repudiated. Watch America's 11th Hour on part of the 14-part prophecy series on this YouTube channel. Go to the playlist. The first 10 parts are 7 deadly myths in Christianity. The last 4 parts are America's 11th Hour. And you'll see that America is going to fulfill that prophecy in Revelation. But empires, here's the wake-up call, are the most dangerous when they are dying. They are reckless, they are foolish, they are evil at that period of the flailings of an empire in decline and death. When Americans are polled and asked in surveys, do you think your nation is having signs of national decline? 25 years ago, hardly anybody said that, only a quarter. Today, it's 2/3. A supermajority of Americans say, yeah, we are a nation in decline. Do you think your children will be poorer than you a generation from now? Answers to this on poll surveys are the most pessimistic that they've been since World War II. By the way, there's also atrophy in churches. A church that will appear as if it is about to fall but shall not fall. A church that is the remnant church of Bible prophecy, with the testimony of Jesus, which is the spirit of prophecy, with the commandments of God, with the faith of Jesus Christ, with no guile in their mouth, in white apparel. But there's also Laodicea, about that 7th church of 7 in history. Laodicea, lukewarm, God wants to spit us out of his mouth. We got to look at Laodicea in the mirror, by the way. But also, don't be surprised when we see institutional decay, because that is what this prophecy about the 4 horsemen is actually about. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are symbolic. It's not showing that there's going to be war for this period, and then there's going to be famine for this period, and then there's going to be war and famine and pestilence for this period. It's using those historical clusters and the order of them in order to show the decline of the church. White and pure, the first horseman is not apocalyptic in the negative sense. The first horseman has white and a crown. It's the gospel going forth, and then the church declining until it's in the pale death of the dark ages with war, pestilence, and famine of spiritual virtue. But there's a literal application also, because we do know from Matthew 24 and other scriptures that war, famine, and pestilence are going to take place in the last days. So you could say there's a literal application, particularly of that pale horse. But if our empire, if America as a republic is declining and falling, and the institutions that we look to, we see so many struggles with, I'm speaking of religious institutions, we see this is not going the right direction here or here. Just take heart, because Jesus knows his bride as his own. And she shall not be moved, and she shall not fall. And you are the church of God. You shall not be moved. Another cycle description. Let's do another cycle. This is another 7. And let's apply this one to the U.S. Poverty brings patience. That describes the Revolutionary War generation. Patience brings peace. That's our early republic in America. Peace makes plenty. 19th century, prosperity. Plenty makes pride. Boy, you're loving all these P's, aren't you? It's not going to continue with P's till the end, but plenty does tend to make pride. Post-Civil War, Gilded Age, robber barons, corruption. Pride breeds war. You get the birth of the American imperialism of 1898. War, victory in World War I and II brings spoil. The tremendous prosperity of the post-World War II era, which tends to then spoil, brings poverty, because from the other cycle, it brings complacency. You can superimpose these upon one another. They're different ways of saying the same thing, but but I like how they're all sevens. Another seven. This is a third seven. America is at the end of all three of them. Party realignments. In 1788, you had the two parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. In 1828, you get the birth of the Democratic Party. In 1860, the founding of the Republican Party. In 1896, the Republican Party sort of gets a makeover in imperialism. In 1932, the Democratic Party gets a makeover with the New Deal. In 1980, same thing on the Republicans, the Reagan Revolution. And in 2016, the Trump populism, which took the political spectrum by storm. Interestingly, these are each about 40 years apart, and we're at the seventh one. What that means, I'll leave to the listener to decide, but we're at the end of several sevens of different cycles. One sure sign of national decline and how we're to that dragon period of America in Revelation 13 is division and polarization. A house divided against itself cannot stand, Jesus said. And Abraham Lincoln said the same about America. He was absolutely right. And when you look at probably the top cycles forecaster in the world today, Martin Armstrong, with his computer that's been looking at historical data and spewing out information about what's to come based on cycles. He said back in the 80s, 2016 is going to be the time of the rise of an insurgency presidency type of figure who's like a third party. It's exactly what happened. So he saw this party realignment coming through his cycles indicators. And he's saying now that 2024 election is not going to be accepted by either side. It may be the last presidential election in American history, and civil unrest rises into 2025. So when I say polarization, division is a sign of an empire that is falling, and house divided against itself cannot stand. The cycles seem to indicate that that's where we are going. And we saw this in America's 11th hour as well. This thing about the coming will not be accepted by either side, that he's saying 2028, there may not even be an election. And 2024, if you can call it an election. So end of America level, apocalyptic type of stuff. That's not hyperbole when I open a session like this with these kinds of words. The kinds of interactions people want to avoid most are people with the other side of the political spectrum. Not that religion, that race, that socioeconomic status that often divides us. I mean, we're seeing more racial division, unfortunately, but it's people of that political party or ideology that I want to avoid. And people are literally moving from red states to blue states, from blue states to red states. States are advertising themselves as havens from those bad kinds of people. Come over here and you'll be able to do this, and you won't be like it is in that place. And you might wonder, with so much divergence of ideology, what are the common values? What are the civic principles that make a nation today? It once was freedom of speech, mutual tolerance, your constitutional principles of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and checks and balances and federalism and all these things that we learned about in civics class that people don't seem to know, because when young people are asked about having a unitary leader that makes the decisions, they want that more than they want congressional procedure and a proper constitutionally functioning government. We are not one nation under anything anymore. I mean, God is still God, but we are not one. We are divided. And so the things that used to at least keep things together don't anymore. And so when we transition to the fourth turning, is what it's called, the seasons of life and of societies, you're going to see these cycles indicating that the civil war that we've already seen is brewing. And when you look at survey data of people, they expect civil war is imminent. 50% of people expect it in America. That might sound unbelievable, but it's the world in which we live now. I want to just slow down a little bit for a second and think about the seasons of a human life. Well, it says, welcome to the season of crisis and a storm relentless in its fury. The season of crisis is the winter season, but we'll get to that in society and in history in a moment. But your life starts with childhood, then you have young adulthood, then you have middle age, then you have your senior years. When do you become a fully legal adult in America? 21 for all purposes. What's the youngest president ever to be elected? 45. And when do you receive your Medicare? 65. So we'll use that as our rough childhood and youthhood till 21. Young adult, 21 to 43. Middle age, I don't love this fact because I just turned 43 last year, but 43 to 65, middle age. And those of you in your senior golden years receiving that Medicare 65 and over, the winter season. Now, if individuals' lives kind of pattern in like spring, new birth, summer, flourishing and developing, fall, and then winter, the over the hill, to use the unfortunate term, maybe society has the same thing. Maybe generations actually have unique character to them. The boomers, the Gen X, the millennials, and these kinds of things. Generations are a very biblical way to look at history. The generating of, and so begat so-and-so. That's to generate, the genesis of, the beginning of. And so to view history as a succession of generations is actually more biblical than dating years by such and such BC and AD. That's a more modern way of viewing it. In the biblical times, it was just by generations. So let's look at the fourth turning is here by Neil Howe. His colleague, the late Strauss, the Strauss-Howe cyclical view of history, took the historical profession by storm, and even Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States, said their perspective on history, the books that they were putting out back then, were the best books on history that he'd ever read. So the power elite themselves see value in this view of history, its predictive power. And I'm going to share with you, okay, so you got the 4 seasons. I'm going to look at just a few of America's turnings from winter to spring. And you're going to go, oh yeah, this does happen. Let's go to the founding generation. This was a time of war and crisis, wasn't it? In fact, the name of Thomas Paine's famous publication was The American Crisis. So it was definitely a crisis season, like a winter season, followed by a rebirth, the forming of and the founding of the American Republic. So we went from winter in the 1770s and 80s into spring. Fast forward 80 years from the surrender of the British in 1781, you get to 1861 and the beginning of the Civil War, another crisis season. Did I mention that the Romans and also Howe and Strauss have noticed 80 to 105 year periods of time are what it takes to get through all 4 seasons? That's pretty interesting. So from one to the next, we had 80 years to 1861. And then after the Civil War, the freeing of the slaves and sort of the rebirth of a new republic in the sense of the United States as a nation, and states are not seceding anymore, and it's really a new form of government. That's a whole political science discussion that needs to be had another time. But fast forward 80 years from 1861 and you get 1941. These are cycling pretty interestingly, aren't they? That was, of course, a day that will live in infamy. So you get the American crisis, 1780s. You get 1770s and 80s. You get a house divided against itself cannot stand, Civil War generation. You get a day that will live in infamy. Crisis, crisis, crisis. Each time followed by a rebirth. After World War II, Pax Americana, the bipolar world, America being one of the 2 superpowers during the Cold War and having a national security apparatus. Again, a new form of government of sorts. Fast forward 80 years from 1941. And you get COVID dystopia, 2021, the year of the mandates, which I think is part of World War III, because you'll notice each time there's a big war. We're going to talk about this in just a minute. But in the past, our 3 crises had our 3 greatest presidents, according to most estimates and historians in ranking them. And so people might not have as much confidence in national leadership in our time to look to people like these great presidents. So it tells me, I wonder if we are at a place where we should be having optimism, or if we're looking at end of America type of things that we've been discussing. Now, a few facts about the winter or crisis season. Usually there's an economic crash that inaugurates it. In 2 out of the 3 crisis seasons in American history, a president died. One was assassinated. That was Abraham Lincoln. There's always a giant war. And that's where the coming crisis, I will not be moved. The coming crisis, 2025 to 2030, matters for this point right here. In the crisis season, there is always a giant war. And it's not just 3 cycles. You might say, well, that's only 3. Sure, they were exactly, so many years apart, and they've cycled exactly on 80 to 105 year periods. Go back to the 6 giant wars of Anglo-American history. They were all in winter seasons, spread out perfectly. And you can also look at a scholar like Toynbee, who found about 100 years, 95 years on average, from one giant war to the next through European history. So there they are on the screen: War of Roses, defeating the Spanish Armada, Glorious Revolution. This is British history, of course, and it transitions to American history in this Anglo-American empire for the last 500 years. That one I mentioned, Civil War, World War II I mentioned, and these are all cycling on time. So if we had 6 And we're starting to see war erupt in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, and maybe with COVID. In fact, you could identify the beginning of World War III. We'll get to that. I'm gonna pause that. But what is the most likely time window? What is the most likely season of history on the Strauss-Howe cycle theory to find fulfillment of Revelation 13? Would it be in the summer, the awakening season? That's like the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. That was taking place in a summer season. The Puritan awakening in England in the 17th century, that was happening in a summer season. The Great Awakening in the American colonies in the 1740s and 50s, that was happening during a summer season. The Millerite Awakening, summer season. Secular historians acknowledge Miller. Unfortunately, there were counterfeit movements of awakenings, like we're going to have a perfect utopia, and we're going to have these communes and bring in the millennium, but the Millerite movement, 1830s and 40s, a summer season. The 60s and 70s was a summer season. It was a time of awakening to the age of Aquarius and the New Age counterfeits again, and the Jesus movement and all of that through the 60s and 70s, the hippies and the Jesus freaks as they were known. These are not likely seasons for crackdowns, for no buy, no sell, for Revelation 13. They're awakening seasons, not crisis seasons that contain signs of the times and wars and rumors of war and pandemics. They're economically prosperous, and there are times where people are philosophically thinking. They're not into so much action and persecution. The philosophical is 2-to-1. College students in the 60s and 70s say developing a meaningful philosophy of life is more important than getting ahead and doing, succeeding in a career. Fast forward to the 80s and 90s, and that reverses completely. It's all about individualism, not developing a meaningful philosophy of life and some movement and awakening that I'm a part of. It's about individual expression, individualism, individual liberty, and getting ahead and succeeding is twice as important as developing a meaningful philosophy of life in polls of college students of the same age group as previously mentioned. So this also is not going to be a likely season for collective action. The whole world wonders after the beast, because individualism, individual conscience, is highly prized in the fall season. So summer and fall are not as likely. Winter, when you transition from fall to winter, it moves us from individualism to collectivism. From live and let live to conflict, conquest, it's holy war time. Defeat the other. We are a tribal group collective mind in the winter season because it's a crisis. So this is more likely, isn't it? As a potential scenario and culture and political culture for persecution, for the whole world wonders after the beast, because it's collectivism. It's mobilization to meet the crisis. And crisis seasons, winter seasons, are where you have the wars, famines, and pestilences. And for our part, the gospel going out to the ends of the earth, and then shall the end come. These are the things you expect in a winter crisis season. You tend to have a sequence of events like this. There's a catalyst that inaugurates the crisis. Ours happened in 2008. So you want to know what season we're in and how long this season is? It began in 2008, so we are now in the latter half of it. Mobilization of society to meet the crisis either in a unified fashion or in a polarized fashion during civil war. Consolidation of power to meet the crisis. Maximum collective energy. Leaders redirect all institutional energy to meet a common goal with an intensity that nobody foresaw before the catalyzing event. Then the climax. There's little concern. Does this sound like Revelation 13? Little concern about harsh government methods to meet the crisis. From personal fury to public fury. That means state organs, government agencies and entities, the people having their will done through that as the group mind takes hold. Whether the enemies are internal or external, they become categorized, demonized, vilified. Liberties are restricted. Strict censorship. You've seen some echoes of this during COVID already, haven't you? Within one crisis season, you tend to have a few of these, the sequence of 4 steps repeated. And in the second half of the crisis season, it's more intense. And we're not done yet. Public action happens in a tsunami-like momentum. It's more like nature's most violent storms than a mere season. That reminds me of a statement I read somewhere that says, a storm is coming, relentless in its fury. And if we think we're in a time of normalcy and peace and safety right now, yes, the angels are holding back the 4 winds of strife. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But in a heartbeat, There can be decades where nothing happens, but then there are weeks when decades happen. I don't normally quote that individual in the affirmative, but that is a true statement, is it not? History actually speeds up during the times of the crisis, particularly the latter half of the crisis season. So it's certainly not the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama claimed in the early 90s, but you have to think of it like as a grand finale of a fireworks display. You might read that this is going to burst upon the world as an overwhelming surprise. So we know this, but history also validates that. So there's our crisis season, 2008 to 2032. Now I put 2032, you can't know till you're out of it, and I don't even want to count on having till 2032. I've been instructed, don't put off far off the close of time, 20 years or 10 years or even 5 years. And so 2032, that's a few years from the recording of this. Will we ever see a 2032? I don't know. I don't want to count on that. But 2032 is an average of Neil Howe's fourth turning estimates that based on the lengths of previous cycles and based on the length of a generation today, that this crisis season should be from 2008 to 2030 or 2034. So why did I put 2032 on this? Well, it's just the average of 2030 and 2034. Also, interestingly, Martin Armstrong has 2032 as the end of the Republic. That's what his cycles, his AI, his computer indicates. So 2028, who knows, all bets are off for elections. 2032, there just isn't an America as we've known it. So let's look at the question of this giant war 7 times in a row here in a crisis season. Civil War or World War III or both? Polling data, I already mentioned this. 50% of Americans say civil war is imminent. Civil war began last time on the heels of an election. And it could happen again on the heels of an election this year. And it doesn't have to be secession. It probably won't be secession of states from the Union, at least right away. But what we're looking at is civil unrest to a level that police action cannot contain. That's the definition of civil war, is any type of violence that normal police action cannot contain. Hollywood's foreshadowing it again. Remember the Obama's film? That was about a grid down after a cyber attack and a apocalyptic scenario. Well, here you have another apocalyptic film called Civil War, released on the anniversary of the American Civil War of 1861, April 12. So not being too subtle there, are we? Also, the legitimacy of the U.S. federal government is almost gone. So that tells me every man for themselves is what the mindset is going to be, and you have no legitimacy of the federal government when only a third of the people in this country believe that the 2020 election was not stolen. Only a third believe that the election was not stolen. Half of this country, after Biden said our patience is wearing thin, vaccine mandates, half of this country believes that the COVID-19 vaccine has killed a significant number of people. What legitimacy is there left in the mind of half of the country then? So civil war, not a stretch to look at. And we have a lot more to say about all these things. This is obviously the abbreviated version. So there's a lot more of a case to be made from a scholarly perspective for civil war, imminent civil war. And again, I don't mean the war between the states, federal government versus a collection of seceded states. We're just talking about conflict amongst ideologies and geographical regions, but a lot more messy than the Civil War with the line and the Mason-Dixon line and the Southern Confederacy. So World War III? The Kremlin says Russia is in a state of war in Ukraine. Basically, this spokesman for Russia's government says when the West got together to back Ukraine, that made us at war with the West. So in Russia's mind, they are at war with the United States, and they announced that. We're kind of be all subtle about it. Not we. I'm not at war with anybody. But the United States has a proxy war against Russia with Ukraine as their proxy, right? And so has World War III already started? Zelensky said maybe it already has. Or maybe in 2020 with the release of a bioweapon it started. You had Chinese laboratory. This is Russia, China, you have Iran, you have Middle Eastern issues. Injectable bioweapon, 2021. So maybe World War III started in 2020. Maybe it started in 2021. Maybe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine it started in 2022. Maybe with Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th of 2023 it started. World War III started. Maybe with Iran's attack on Israel in April of 2024. We got some options to choose from. We view 1939 as the beginning of World War II, but other Chinese historians look at 1937 as the beginning of World War II. That was when Japan invaded Manchuria. So time will tell, but the fact that we are probably already in it is likely. And Armstrong's cycles pinpoint 2025 as when World War III really explodes, but prior to an election in 2024, he's seeing signals for May and July of this year as high risk for increase of war, and then nuclear by 2027. Now, this is not a prophecy. Things are not certain. They're probabilities. But that's why we want to say I don't want to delay. Because we could be seeing things tonight, right now, on the news that change everything. I remember how shocking it was when COVID-19 and lockdowns happened. The president got on, he's like, 15 days to flatten the curve. And our lives were never the same after that for the next couple of years. So nuclear by 2027? Question mark. Could history break away from the cycles? I like to end with this. Of course. God made the sun stand still or appear to stand still. God is sovereign. 2 words, divine sovereignty. God can break this history from these cycles any time he pleases because he speaks things into existence because he is God. And you have scriptures that talk about shortening the days of persecution and cutting the work of righteousness short. He will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness. So I can't assume I have 2025 and 2027. I've got to be ready today. Be ye also ready, for as in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. And we know there are some events that have to transpire first. But I want to be ready for the latter rain. Because if I'm not ready for the latter rain, the second coming of the Holy Spirit, then that will fall, and those who are not receiving the latter rain because they're not experiencing revival and reformation now will not receive the latter rain, and the shaking takes place. And then the second coming, you're not preparing for the second coming per se. You're preparing for the thing that gets you finally ready for the second coming. And if you miss that, you miss out. Don't miss out on the sweet, sweet Spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, which we need to pray for and yearn for and experience more and more in our lives. And also, God could delay things, though it tarry, wait for it. So prophecy can tarry in our minds, but it will not tarry in the end, because in God's timeline, his purposes know no haste and no delay. But I want you to think about this from the perspective of Revelation 7, the 4 angels holding back the 4 winds of strife. Why are they holding it back? Why are they holding back the winds of strife? Now, it's of course so we can finish the work, because this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end shall come. So we have a work to do, and we have this strangely long period of peace and safety. In the second half of a crisis season, the second half is always the worst. We're in the 1860s, right? The Civil War. We're in 1941. We're in the period right now, in 2024 already. The latter half of this decade, according to Joel Skousen's World Affairs Brief, he's been saying World War III wasn't supposed to start in the late 19-teens and the early 2020s, the 20-teens and the early 2020s. It is scheduled for the latter half of this decade. And so we're on borrowed time is the bottom line there. For what purpose? For finishing the work. For presenting the gospel. And here's the rest of the scripture. He cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have, what's the next word? Why is God giving us the time that he's giving us? That we may be sealed. Sealing of the servants of our God in their foreheads. What is the seal of God? The people of God are sealed in their foreheads. This is my favorite definition of the seal of God. It is not any seal or mark that can be seen, but what is the seal? It is a settling into the truth, both intellectually and spiritually, so they can not be moved. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, there is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her in that right early. The heathen raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. My friends, stand secure in his strength, with his armor, in his righteousness alone. Your title to heaven and your fitness for heaven are both alike found in the righteousness of Christ. Surrender all to him, and you shall not be moved.